Good afternoon and welcome to the next session with the Engage EHS Summit. Today we're going to be talking about driving C-suite engagement in safety, so looking forward to that one. We've got two great panelists to go through that today and some really interesting points to discuss, and really looking forward to that chat. Just before I do, we're going to do a little bit of the housekeeping and run through, maybe just remind ourselves what's here for anyone who's new. If you've been on a few of these sessions, it's probably old hat and you know what to do, but we'll go through it anyway just to keep everybody tuned in. So on the right-hand side of our screen, you will see, well, if you don't see it, there's a little arrow so you can expand out. But if you have it expanded already, you should see 4 little sections that we can kind of interact with. So we have a chat section. Chat is, give us a shout out, say hello, tell us where you're dialed in from. Talk to yourselves, whatever it might be. That's not a problem. So you can entertain yourselves with other points of view and throw in your points of view as we're going through that. That's absolutely great, and great to see any sort of engagement there. We have polls, so we'll probably be asking some questions as we go through as well, trying to get some perspectives from you guys. So again, please, if we kind of call that out, it'd be great if you can interact with that and give us some feedback. It always helps us understand where you're coming from, what you're looking to do, to hear, and gives us some direction around what we want to chat about as well. And then the Q&A section on the very end one, the last one, was really focused about questions for the panel. So if you have something particular that you want to ask, it may get lost in chat. So please throw it in the Q&A, and then that way we'll make sure we address those questions. So what we'll do is we'll go through the panel. We might pause maybe midsection for a couple of questions if there's pertinent ones at that point, or else deal with them maybe more towards the end. So that's the kind of the how-to. So do please let us know where you are and what's going on, and welcome, and we'll crack on. So we have 2, as I said, great panelists today. We did have 3, but unfortunately we lost one last minute. So Kevin Hand won't be able to join us. So starting off, we have Zoe Davies. Zoe is the Senior Health and Safety Advisor at IMG, a graduate from the University College of London, and has spent several years studying the use of language in literary context, culture, and interpretation, and the in-house Senior Health and Safety Advisor at IMG, a fast-paced sports, events, and media company. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you. Hi.
Anything you'd like to add into the bio beyond the slide? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I've got a few health and safety qualifications as well. So I would say I'm probably classically trained in health and safety. So I'm NEBOSH diploma, and gone up through that route. But I suppose I've found a way of combining both my interests of language and sales in with health and safety culture. So it's been a few years of applying a few different methods that I now have a few opinions on. So so I'm a traditional health and safety advisor on the NEBOSH diploma route as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And on the panel as well, we have Mike Webster. So Mike is a director at MPW R&R, a chartered engineer with over 30 years experience specializing in CDM, construction and structural safety. Mike also provides consulting and expert witness services and has been instructed by both defence and prosecution teams in construction-related cases. Mike, welcome.
Yeah, I come from a slightly different background to Zoe, but probably to a sort of non-traditional health and safety. My background is very much in the construction industry, and I first of all got interested in structural safety and sort of, are structures safe? Why are they safe? How can we tell whether they're safe? And then I got interested in the sort of why side as well as the what side, in the sort of why do things go wrong? What causes accidents to happen? How do organizations and individuals perform? And I did a lot of work for Health and Safety Executive, looking at sort of organizational factors and in terms of, sort of construction, agriculture, waste, major hazards, a few other sort of wider industries. And then when I started my own business 5 years ago, it was a good opportunity to put it all together, the sort of how things go wrong, the why things go wrong. And I spend a lot of my time these days doing expert witness work when things do go wrong, and gives you quite a good insight into sort of how organizations perform and what the key issues are.
Great. No, listen, great to have you both here. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Both of the guys are giving up their time, and we're doing this in I better introduce myself first as well. I'm Dara. I'm the CEO with Engage. There's my slide. So one of the co-founders in the company. I'm just delighted to be here today to facilitate the conversation with the lads. So look, yeah, both of the guys are giving up their time today, and this is kind of a charity event. We're doing a great bit of traction so far, raising money for the NHS charities together and St James's Hospital in Ireland. So obviously, predominantly we're based between the UK and Ireland. So there's 2 charities there. So if you haven't already, and if you feel like you're getting some value from the last 2 days, please, any little donation at all is greatly appreciated for both of those charities. So yeah, today's discussion is going to be focused really around the driving C-suite engagement. So we're probably going to talk about that from a few different perspectives. We all know the importance of engagement for employees and safety and making sure people are involved and engaged. But I think it's fair to say it's just as important that you have C-level engagement, board-level engagement. Without that, you don't have budgets, you don't have commitment, you don't get leadership. So we want to talk about it from that perspective, focusing on that C-level, board-level engagement. How do we get that? How do we promote it? How do you communicate to the board effectively to get your business case for your investment or your initiative across the line? So really kind of focusing on that area today. And how that can really drive a benefit then for your business. So without that kind of support, it's you're in a safety canoe without a paddle. You're on your own somewhere trying to struggle up the river. So we're going to try and focus on that today a little bit and talk about engaging the board, communicating value, barriers that you see, and we're going to go through a few of those different points. There's also a poll I think just being launched, which I've seen has popped up on my screen, and so yeah, if you can start with that, I think that's just kind of a starting position to get a little bit of feedback from you guys, if we can, just around the type of engagement that you've seen in your career or in your job right now from the board and from C-level. So I suppose where we're going to start, Mike, we might start with you really, and just get some points around probably the troubles people face first of all. So talking about maybe the barriers that health and safety people or teams face when they're trying to both communicate the value, maybe to senior management, and in terms of getting that support. So those barriers that you see maybe commonly when you engage with people in the industry.
Yeah, I thought one of the best ways of answering this might be to look back at some of the major incidents that have been reported and investigated in the last 10, 15 years or so, because it's quite valuable when you get those big investigations like into the Mid-Staffs hospital, the Buntsfield oil storage depot, the Texas City explosion and fire. These are the sorts of things where the government investigators have had access to all areas and have gone in and identified key issues. And I just wanted to bring up some of the issues that they'd found in those 3, and that sort of helps give us a good understanding of sort of where the barriers come from and why the barriers are there. So first of all, looking at a Mid-Staffs, which was a hospital in Staffordshire in England, Midlands, and there was up to about 1,500 or so unexplained fatalities there, and the government decided to launch an inquiry into that with Robert Francis QC, and that showed sort of culture that was focused on serving the system, not the patients, a sort of culture that put more weight on positive information about the service than on information giving causes for concern. Methods of measuring compliance were really looking at the service rather than the effect on the patients. There was too great a degree of tolerance of poor standards and risk to patients, assumption that monitoring health and safety was someone else's responsibility, not those, and a failure to appreciate the risk of corporate memory loss and the effects of multiple reorganizations, both internally generated and government generated. And those sorts of things, you probably see them in a lot of organizations, but certainly in my experience, you need many things to be sort of heading in the wrong direction simultaneously to get sort of bad health and safety results out of it. And if you then look at the next one, Buntsfield, where it was the largest explosion in the UK since the Second World War, when the oil depot blew up back in 2005. There were the management systems, they had them in place, they weren't particularly good and they weren't properly followed. And there was an awful lot of pressure put on staff and it got to the point that there was fuel coming in from so many sources that they weren't able to monitor properly the fuel coming in and storage, and they weren't getting support from elsewhere. And together, all these pressures were creating a culture in which the primary focus was actually on keeping the process operating, and obviously not looking at process safety, not getting the attention it required. So that was very much safety getting downgraded just in order to get the job done. And then looking at Texas City, there was allegations of cost cutting, failure to invest, and production pressures from the BP Group executive board, which got in the way of the process safety. The BP boards didn't provide effective oversight of safety culture and the accident prevention program. No board member was responsible for verifying any of these programs. Yeah. And what they did have was, I think, an important point that comes up in my line, the sort of difference between occupational safety and what perhaps I'd term engineering or process safety. There's a reliance there on, they had a low personal injury rate there, so they thought everything was going well. And of course, the difference between slips and trips and manual handling and major process or engineering safety issues, they're completely different issues. So they thought things were going okay because there was low personal injury, with sort of forgetting about the big issues.
Yeah.
And there was sort of checkbox mentality there, and people ticked off things had been done even when they hadn't. The refinery didn't really have a sort of reporting or learning culture, so people weren't encouraged to report problems. So the board then weren't finding out or learning the lessons from near misses, and there was a feeling among workers that actually they feared retaliation if they brought up some of these issues. And when sort of put together, it was a lot of warning signs that were missed. And I think there's a few other examples, but given the time, I sort of bring up three. And I think one thing that will be worth us all having a look at is the report for the Boeing 737 MAX, which is about 300-400 pages, and one of the most critical reports I've seen from American authorities, just looking through. So I think once we start adding these together, we get a series of sort of lessons and issues that are coming up that are barriers. And I think it comes down to things like incentives. The behavior that's sort of reinforced by reward is generally repeated. And at mid-staffs, the issue was getting foundation trust status so they could become independent. And that's what drove the behavior, trying to get that. Then there's things like concerns about loss of productivity. There's a perception that time spent managing risk diverts resources away from what's productive. And I think it's the sort of thing that it's easy for the board to view what's easy to visualize loss from people diverting the resources from what's actually quite a difficult to visualize gain from people putting effort into risk management. And then this issue that we've talked about a couple of times, that this degree of tolerance of poor standards of risk. And I think what you do need is a sort of culture where there's a concern about anything and everything that goes wrong, because it's indicative of something that might be fairly deep within the organization. And
you've used the term culture so many times, right? And I think that's something that's coming through again and again and again, that, you know, if that leadership is focused on certain things, maybe like you said, the bottom line or the wrong KPIs or the wrong focus, or, you know, only about return to shareholders and how we achieve that, but don't actually see a bigger picture of actually how you might improve those things if you focus on some other areas. And that culture, I think, seems to be a major point of commonality. Would that be fair?
It certainly would. And I think perhaps where it relates to today's discussion is that culture tends to be set from the board, and it's what the board, or it's actually what people perceive the board view as important that gets done. And if the board are actively engaged in health and safety, asking challenging questions and sort of leading by example almost, it sets the tone. If the board is very focused, say like at mid-staffs, on getting foundations trust status, that drives behaviours, because there's always that tendency for people to reflect the behaviours that they imagine are required and sort of mirroring what they see as behaviours from the board. And I think that's where culture has both either a positive or negative effect.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, look, the values and the operational values of a business come from, what's set in terms of the objectives of the board, right? So if the CEO and the board are saying, this is what we want, this is what we want, we got to focus on this, we got to focus on returns, we got to focus on percentages, we got to focus on bottom line, then of course that's going to manifest itself, I think, into the business in different ways. And people are going to say, well, we can't spend, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't invest here, just get it done, get it done. And that's often, I think, what you see sometimes when those cultures turn sour. Zoe, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of those barriers that you've seen and come up against?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. The culture piece obviously is a huge campaign. I always say it's the longest chess game I'm going to play in my life, is to change a culture. And I won't finish that chess game. It's like a crusade, isn't it? But you pick your moves and you pick your moments. And whenever there's a strategy, whether it's entry level, mid-level, or going into the C-suite, it's a multi-prong attack. So my background in the middle, I was in construction, health and safety, and then took a few years in sales. So I actually worked for Foxtons, which is a renowned estate agent in central London. And I also had a couple of other sales jobs in corporate hospitality and retail. And I had a lot of sales training. And you have to look at it and go, right, why do we have more than one pair of trainers? Why do we have 6 pair of trainers when we've only got 2 feet generally? Why do I have 5 handbags when I can probably only carry 1? And there's a lot of things that we as health and safety professionals can learn from sales and marketing in order to get people to get it. So one of the toughest things that we have to do is to help people get it, like get health and safety. Now, one of the things that Mike said was the primary focus. Now, I'm not in for people saying, yeah, health and safety is our priority. I call BS on that. Like, it's not a priority. Your priority is your business. Yeah. So I really like that term, primary focus. Now, here's the curveball. Everybody on your C-suite is going to have a different primary focus. In the same way, people go to work for different reasons. Some people just want to pay their bills. Some people want to give back, and some people want to get the most out of themselves. So understanding your C-suite is absolutely critical. And I think that's one of the barriers, is we assume maybe the chief financial thinks one way, the chief HR thinks another. Yeah. And we need to tap in and build and curate our message, our campaign, our please can I have money for some IOSH training, cap in hand. It has to be curated as a bit of a multi-prong attack. Mm-hmm. And it has to be curated per each one. So if anybody, working in a global organization, you will already know that you will have a global framework for training or safety management systems, whatever, lovely corporate, fabulous glossy stuff up here. But in order for it to be effective, genuinely effective, you have to curate it per region. So what I deliver out in India and Jakarta is very different to what I'm putting into a fashion show team in Paris and a marathon event, in Germany. It's very, very different messaging through. So for me, that really is one of the challenges, is understanding the primary focus of those individuals and how we go about tapping into them and then being able to sell to them the thing that I want them to get.
I think that's a really good point, and we might jump in on that in a little bit more depth, I think, as we go down through the questions we have as well. Because I think when you talk about that barrier, I think absolutely, we probably think about it more maybe for the employees, where we ask them to do something different, where you're trying to implement a new safety plan. Everybody says the same thing, maybe internally rather than externally, but what's in it for me? Why am I doing this? That what's in it for me question is like, why am I really going to embrace this change? Why am I really going to think this is something valuable? So I think, at C-level, I think that's a really good point. And maybe a question to you both in terms of, maybe some of those engagements that you've seen and those type of barriers. Have you seen maybe any sort of, and tips for our listeners in terms of the different functions at C-suite, you know, how they maybe react or key things that would have been a barrier for them. So if you think of a CFO, okay, I'm probably looking at how much this is going to cost, and you're going to have to tell me how much my ROI is and have some kind of feedback around that. If I'm a COO, I might have a different approach. In terms of those kind of senior level roles, you know, do you guys have any experience around that? Just in terms of maybe some of the differences that you might have seen? I don't mind who wants to grab it first. Mike, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think one of the examples I have was a health service one from about 10, 12 years ago. It was in terms of patient public engagement, and it's the sort of thing that's essential for hospitals to do, but it's almost viewed as a bit of an overhead. And the people who do it are very committed to healthcare. They're not interested in return on investments and speaking to the finance people in the appropriate language. But the trouble is, it's the finance director who gives the okay for it. And what we ended up doing was producing a tool that enabled the sort of patient public engagement people who weren't really interested in sort of spreadsheets or finance and that, to actually take them through step by step, putting together what the sort of costs and benefits of public and patient engagement were, so that they'd again get a one-page summary that had the steps they wanted to do, what benefits they would get out of it for patients, the benefits that would give for the hospital and the local health community, and the costs. And it meant, armed with that, they could then go along and actually have a discussion with the finance director in the appropriate language. So it meant that something that otherwise might have got put to one side because the sort of healthcare workers weren't particularly comfortable in using that language, it actually gave them tools to communicate in the appropriate language, and then for the finance team to be able to see what overall benefits there were for the expenditure.
Okay, very good. And Zoe, from your side, in terms of those different roles that you've kind of had to come up against, I say it combatively nearly, but the different roles that you've had to come up against and kind of try and communicate that value to, any kind of review?
Again, so this probably give you an insight into my character, but I treat it almost as if I'm going on a date, and I will stalk the life out of them to work out what makes them tick. So I will look on their LinkedIn, and are they somebody that's regularly interacting? You can see on LinkedIn activity, posts, comments. So what are they into? And you see some people are dishing out kudos things, and some people are into nitty gritty McKinsey articles. And I would really tap into what makes them tick. I mean, even how we look, how we talk, how we walk into the room, everything like that, that has a huge impact on how they see us. So I will generally change my, maybe the way I talk, whether I'm talking to somebody who's first language English or not, the way I talk, the materials I'm going to use. So some people want a quick 5 minutes at the desk, quick chat. Other people will want a formal board meeting. Others will want it in a one-pager. Some people will want it in a video overview. So it's just tapping into them, kind of stalk them really, and find out what makes them tick. Not everybody is as typical as you would think in terms of those roles and how they got there. And not everybody is going to be older than you as well. That's something to bear in mind as well, as how the different generations consume information. And that's kind of part of the language piece and the communication. But all my C-suites, so we often take in agencies and sports media companies, and they're all cool and fresh and jeans and hoodies and coding, like everything's really, really modern. So not all my C-suite types are, significantly older, and there are a lot of younger people that want to communicate in very, very different ways, and they want to engage in it a different way, and they want to see a kind of a safety project that's absolutely integrated into the way they think, what their objectives are, and something that makes it easy for them. But the other thing as well, I would say, do your homework, and sometimes you do have to learn a bit more. So, for example, one of the chief operations is ex-McKinsey. One of the McKinsey methods for problem solving is MECE, mutually exclusive, comprehensively exhaustive. And I would use that model when presenting something to them because it's talking their language, it's what they're into. It took me days to get my head around that, and I had to get some help. But you get it over the line because you're talking their language. Just make it as easy as possible for them to basically buy that second-hand bag.
And well, look, I think you've nailed it in terms of, you know, it is that sales pitch, right? And you're using that sales experience, that sales training to say, okay, I have to sell this to everybody in the organization in a way that they're going to understand why we should buy, you know, or why they should buy. They have to give it a yes. That's very interesting. So maybe just while we're still thinking about those kind of challenges and barriers, and before we move on to maybe some of the you know, happier sides of the topics and when things go well, but for those barriers, you know, what do you see, I suppose, when people, you know, continue to put up that wall for investment in safety or for driving changes in safety? What are the things that you've seen? I mean, obviously, we look at incidents, we look at, the kind of typical and obvious stuff that comes out of it. But even in terms of culture and in terms of how the company operates, anything that you see from, you know, where you have that roadblock in the C-level, what does that manifest itself like in businesses that you've worked in? Zoe, if you want to grab that one first, maybe just while
yeah. So sometimes you'll see things differently, and sometimes companies will take a view. So some companies are not giving any ergonomic equipment for people working at home, and that's tough. So you're really on the tipping point of DSE regulation compliance. So that's your legal argument. You've got moral, people are going to be hurt, less productivity, you've ticked that. Financial, this is going to cost you more because you've got more referrals in the longer term. And you've just got to get really good. And then reputational. So legal, moral, financial, those are the founding, you know, the kind of founding fathers of selling safety. But reputational is one of the ones that a lot of people will be thinking about. So if you can tie your arguments into the reputational risk, I think that will help with kind of pushing it through. But there are some times where you do have to go, well, look, and this is where, so I actually started my safety career working for the family business, which was construction. So it's my father's company, my brother's a director now, I stood back, not my gig. But fundamentally, I was banging my head against the wall trying to get my dad to take things seriously. And he was like, yeah, safety, that's your job. You do the safety, it's not my job. And it took me years, but I was like, eventually I had to say to him, I was like, look, it's your name on the door. I legally cannot take responsibility for this, unless you make me a director, but we're not going down that route. But it's your name above the door. And if things hit the fan, it's your name going into the front page of the local newspaper, and it's your name going into the courts. It's not mine, but my job is to protect the house. And I think I've probably said that 300 times in the last 7.5 years, 9.5 years I've been at ING. My job is to protect the house and the people whose names are above the door. So that's one of the ways I'm trying to push through sometimes when I've tried everything and go, do you know what? It's your name above the door and you can take that decision. But you have to exhaust your legal, moral, financial, and reputational. You have to get so good at reputational reasons for doing some good health and safety.
Oh, great. Mike, anything to add in there?
Yeah, I think Zoe's touched on quite an important point there about reputation. And it's something that is really much more prominent these days, where the moment something goes wrong, there's somebody there with a smartphone tweeting it out to the rest of the world. And it's very easy to have your reputation trashed in a matter of minutes or hours if you're not on top of it. And I think one of the things I've seen promoted by lawyers and insurers is the sort of crisis management approach. Not only do you need to be thinking about stopping or trying to make sure these things don't happen, but we know unfortunately things do go wrong on occasions. Think about beforehand what you need to do if things do go wrong, because your reputation can be trashed so quickly that you need to actually take control of the situation and make sure it's your communications that sort of getting the headlines and reassuring people, and not sort of relying on passers-by.
And you can use safety to get yourself some good articles in the press and use safety as part of the conversation. So there are, in construction, you do typically see these zero accidents, these kind of super campaigns, but there are campaigns where you don't call it a health and safety campaign. I'm very much a fan of don't call it a safety meeting, don't call it a safety briefing, don't call it safety training. Just get that kind of word away. But in terms of how you can use safety to kind of improve your company's PR, let's call it. So Google is a really good example recently. They gave every employee £1,000 to go spend on Amazon on chairs, keyboards, mice, etc. It's great for the PR. They get into the press for the right reasons. And it's all about getting your name on the searches and search engine optimization by making sure your conversation is positive. And there are now examples. So that for me has been a great leverage to go, hey, Google have done it and Google have bragged about it. Yeah. So not only have they done good health and safety, lovely compliance, tick the box in-house, they've bragged about it and they've got themselves some extra conversation online. So when people search for Google, let's say they're applying for the company or similar companies, you can see what their response has been. And it's a health and safety thing, but it didn't get called Google does great health and safety. It just says, hey, I got £1,000 from Google. And I mean, we all know a chair doesn't fix, a sore back, but it's one step closer to better PR.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think people have to be thinking about that now in the modern age. Like I said, there's so much that relies on that reputational, but we do see people, I think, using their, safety records as a sales tool as well. So, generating more business from that when you're able to communicate the positive. So I know we've been kind of talking about all the negative bits, but when you're, and the challenges that you face, but when you do utilize that and when you do actually generate that kind of positive response, it can be used to build up momentum in both hiring, so retaining talent, getting talent, generating sales, getting more interest online, SEO, your search engine optimization. So there's a lot of benefits there, I think, from the engagement side. And there's one story that always sticks in my head from The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg's book, and it's the story of Alcoa, and they were smashed on the bottom of the, they lost hundreds of millions off their listing price. They had, they were on the verge of bankruptcy, and new CEO comes in and says, hey everybody, I'm going to focus on safety, and I think the whole board went, you're mad, what are you doing? All of Wall Street went, this guy is nuts, it's not going to work. But it revolutionized how the workers viewed management. It revolutionized the commitment, I think, that the workers and the engagement that the workers were giving to the company. Productivity increased, share prices increased, and over the course of a few years, they were saving lives, they were making more money, and they were back on track as one of the largest companies in the world. So it was,
absolutely. Yeah. So that CEO of Alcoa, Paul O'Neill, he used habit theory, and habit theory, I absolutely love it. So the classic example is Pepsodent back in the Mad Men days, and you always have cue routine rewards. The cue for toothpaste was, my teeth feel a bit grubby. The reward is, lovely, foamy, minty. It doesn't need to be foamy, it doesn't need to be minty, but they add that in as the cue. And then the reward is, I got nice clean teeth. So I think it's Paul O'Neill. Yeah, Paul O'Neill, the Alcoa guy. His one was, he went for accidents, and he basically put in a reward scheme. So people were always craving for promotion, more pay, bonuses, and he brought safety performance into the bonus system. So the cue was, one of my guys has had an accident. The action is do really good investigation, do some corrective action about it, don't have that accident again. And the reward was promotion or an increase in pay for the manager responsible. But yeah, he went down the habit theory. Yeah. And it was brilliant. It just proved I think it's many years ago, it's a couple of decades ago. An example.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. And they also, obviously, they had to track all that information. They were, and this is where I suppose the interest from our side came in looking at that story as well, was they built one of the first safety management systems. It was like CDOS, and it was green screen stuff, but it was tracking everything, feeding it back to the managers, giving them that feedback around how their teams were performing, and for that performance management piece, so that they could, build that into pay reviews as well. Absolutely, yeah.
And do you know what I find? That makes the conversation with the C-suite. So if you've got C-suiters who are quite academic, or a lot of my C-suite are into behavioral psychology, leadership, management. We had Simon Sinek at one of our retreats recently. So lots of this, really modern thinking and bringing in habit theory and nudge theory. So we use nudge theory in safety, but all these kind of things, and they're kind of aware of that conversation. And there's loads of health and safety examples where you can basically weave into their current conversation about nudge theory, habit theory, and you can go, oh yeah, well, Alcoa did that decades ago. Safety and nudge and habit theory has been going for decades. Same as nudge theory, safety and nudge theory has been going for ages. So you can kind of bring that in and talk in that conversation, where they want to go with their leadership and the human kind of behavioral psychology side of it.
Yeah.
You can really weave into it.
No, great. And Mike, from your side, when you see those kind of good news stories and you see that, positive developments, positive engagement, any kind of, insights from yourself in terms of customers you've worked with or people you've worked with where you've really seen that drive success?
Yeah, I think it follows on from something Zoe's touched on in yourself. It's the treating health and safety the same as any other important issue and not differently. And it's something that I went to a talk about 10-15 years ago, Judith Hackett, when she was chair of the HSE. And to paraphrase it, she said, a lot of people say safety is their #1 priority. We know it's not. We don't expect it to be. However, we expect it to be one of your top priorities. And in a lot of the cases I work on as expert witness, one of the key regulations is the construction design and management regulations. And one of the criteria there is that safety should be treated the same as any other key business issue. So when you're looking at an organization, that's what you always look at. Is there evidence that they've treated it in the same? And I think probably the best example I've seen of that, a very positive one, was the London Olympics and the construction of that back in the run up to 2012. And it's probably the best example I've seen in my working career, construction. And one of the things that struck me was that they didn't have health and safety meetings. They had risk meetings and risk discussions. And obviously, when you've got a fixed deadline, I mean, you can't really have the Olympics slipping back to 2013 or 14. You've got a fixed program. You've got a fixed budget, admittedly a very large one. You're working in the glare of the world's media. So anything that goes wrong, be it environmental, safety, it's going to be an issue. So when they were discussing the projects, it was always an integrated meeting. They got the right people along because anything you might do to speed up the program might have an environmental impact, it might have a cost impact, it might have a safety impact. And so you need to be discussing it all together in order to get those trade-offs, so that somebody doesn't say, hey, it'd be great if we took a bit of a shortcut here and there to get finished quickly. And then somebody said, well, actually, yeah, that's going to end up being unsafe. And if that's unsafe, that'll end up us putting it right, which then involve another 3-4 weeks work. And so it's getting people to think about these issues more holistically, because they are related. They all have knock-ons. And I think one of the beliefs I have is that health and safety shouldn't be seen as a bolt-on. It should be seen as integrated. And yet the business is there for a purpose, but there's multiple drivers on that, or multiple influences on that business, that all need to be considered together. And if you can get a sensible balance between them, like they did in the Olympics, you're actually getting something that hits the program, stays within budget, there was no fatalities on there, first Olympics ever, no environmental issues. And it was a real success story for British construction. Yeah. And a lot of it by taking that approach.
Absolutely, and I think that's it. I mean, again, you want it to be ingrained in the culture. You want it to be something that people do without thinking, but obviously you have to drive, the business in that direction, and that's down to the leadership and the management teams as well to drive that. Zoe, I mean, you work in an industry that's probably not typically considered something a high risk industry, right? It's not okay. construction of cranes and big machinery, so events.
Yeah.
What's that like in terms of the different status that maybe safety gets within that industry compared to some of the typical high-risk industries?
Yeah, it depends. So Winter Wonderland in Hyde Park is one of the events that we deliver, and unfortunately not this year. Essentially feels like we've cancelled Christmas, but that is a heavy construction, but people are coming into it from a non-construction background. They're coming into it from an event production. And for me, it is basically making sure they get the right training. So yes, you get these IOSH courses, managing safety, but you can curate them. So we have managing safety of live events, managing international events. So we can just curate the message. And if you talk with the trainers, they'll build and get a course accredited that's suitable for what you're trying to do. But then if I look across to maybe, let's say, TV production, so we're a sports production company. Now, the biggest risk for them is coming off the air. Through something that happens. So one of our OB compounds for one of the major golf championships, so an outside broadcast compound where all the TV trucks are. So you've got reams and reams of cables and fiber and signals, and we're beaming all over the world, and it's all, you know, big and glossy. The bin truck came in to collect the bins, and it collected the bins from outside, and it left, you know, the kind of the grabbers, basically, yeah. And it just left them up, drove through our compound and ripped through the fibre. And we went on air. Normally there's 20, 30 cameras. We went on air with 2 cameras as the guys are trying to thread and, you know, repairing fibre is a nightmare. So there are risks. And then the risk of that then is that sponsors lose their airtime, and you've got insurance implications. And I think actually I can see on the Q&A here, David wrote, David's asked if fear of prosecution is the most powerful motivator. I would say it's not for me, because I've been there where companies have been prosecuted, paid the bill, and off we go, we carry on. It's changed slightly with the sentencing guidelines. So when I'm delivering training and I'm saying, look, these fines are uninsurable. I know we've got insurance for contingency, cancellation, kidnap and ransom, public liability, employer's liability, professional indemnity. There's so many policies, but I cannot insure you if you get a telling off by the HSE or any of the other authorities, fines, fee for intervention, and any of the prosecution implications. But it happens, they pay the bill, and we just crack on. The actual, the kind of the things that really get us is where we have an accident. There's kind of those accidents that just cause delays, like Mike was saying with the Olympics, causing a delay, whether you are a production factory, whether you are a construction site, or whether you're a TV company. I think delays are one of the things everybody wants to avoid, because we all know it costs money, time, effort.
Yeah. Mike, anything to add in on that? I think from your side, obviously looking at the kind of the sort of witness side of things as well. Anything to add in from that perspective?
Yeah, I'm finding that actually the enforcement side is acting as a bit of a driver now, because back in 2016, the sentencing rules, sentencing guidelines were amended. And whereas in the past, a large contractor might have got, say, 100, 200,000 fine, which might be cost of doing the business, so to speak. Nowadays, you can be facing multi-million pound fines, and those sorts of things, quite an impact, particularly in construction, where you're working on relatively low profit margins, and you're only making 1%, 2%, 3% margin. And even for a multi-million pound company, to lose a couple of million wipes out a large chunk of that year's profits. And so I'm certainly seeing that taken seriously. I think it's taken seriously in 2 ways. One, in trying to prevent things going wrong in the first instance. There's a lot more effort going into construction health and safety. But then the other impact I'm seeing is when something does go wrong and a prosecution is taken, there seems to be a lot more challenge and defending a prosecution now, because the cost of being fined is potentially multi-million. So it's worth spending out on actually going to court and taking your chances there, or trying to mitigate, or perhaps plead guilty, but then try and mitigate and show that you're you were perhaps at less at fault than the prosecution thought you were, and also putting together your sort of good story of how well you manage health and safety. But it's been certainly quite a big driver in the last 3-4 years.
Mm.
And look, I think certainly with the change in regulations and the change in the fine levels as well, and obviously with the jail terms as well, we see this from a kind of business case perspective from our customers trying to put something forward and go, okay, how do we make that business case? And a lot of the time, the fear factor would be something you try and build in. It's things will go wrong, and it's you may go to prison and you may get But I think, and certainly there may be a bit of a disparity between different types of industries there, because I think when you're talking about assessing that from, let's say, an events management point of view, look, nobody goes to prison for safety, breaches in events management. So why would we stress about that? Don't worry. Maybe that's more relevant or more prevalent, for construction managers. So there may be a kind of a difference, I don't know what you guys think in terms of sector by sector around how you view that. But I think, if you think about the behavioral aspect of that as well, the telling someone you're going to get in trouble generally doesn't get the right response from them either. You have to try and look at the benefits, what's the upside that I'm going to get if I do this, as opposed to what could go wrong if you don't.
Repositioning it. I tell you, one of the ones that has had a good influence on my industry is the Goldscheider versus the Royal Albert Hall. So viola player, a member of the orchestra, suffered hearing damage and was successful in his claim. It's a really, really good case, and very, very good Theo Huckle QC and his team representing Goldscheider. But that's been a really interesting one. And talking to Domi, who's head of safety at the Royal Opera House, it's been a really tough one for the safety team as well to go, well, we thought we had it in hand. The viola player had 2 sets of hearing protection fitted, knew what to wear for which pieces of music. It wasn't like they didn't do anything. They thought they were doing as much as they could. But it's been a really interesting case actually to go at, this noise thing is serious, and look what's happened. So we have motorsport events, and we have lots of people that wear headphones for editing sport and stuff. And that's been a nice one, just to nudge on the conversation and go, look, it's happened, it's kind of saying, well, it's happened in our neighborhood. It's not just construction that get into trouble. It's closer to home now, and we do need to kind of cop onto it.
Yeah. And when we talk about maybe some of the, like, a lot of that is about, again, how you communicate. When you talk about, I suppose, the tailoring maybe those communications, and we've talked about it a few times in different points. How do you think maybe some of the people listening or the safety professionals can maybe tailor their communications to get the most out of that, to get the biggest impact at board level? What do you think works for them? So do you want to keep going on that one, and then or Mike, jump in?
Yeah, I think something we touched on earlier about couching those messages in the business language, just to make sure that the message gets over. And I think perhaps also a cynical one is actually use crisis to leverage some influence, because I know there's an old quote about don't waste a good crisis. It's, if something is going wrong, then that is a good opportunity to actually get the message over. You see how bad this is, you see the impact it's had on people's lives. You really don't want to repeat that. These are the sorts of steps we can take to try and stop it happening again. And I think other sorts of tips, things like appreciating, I think as Zoe said, the board members do come from different backgrounds. Somebody who might come from a more operational background, it might be easier to visualize. Somebody who comes from a more sort of admin type background, it might be perhaps more difficult for them to visualize what the issues are. So again, I think it's back to this couching it, or understanding the people, understanding their backgrounds, their drivers, what they're going to understand in terms of how you get those positive messages over. And I think one of the things I've seen over the years is almost sort of, don't expect things to happen straight away. You've got to be fairly patient with these things and sort of coach or nudge or shove, sort of push people gently in the right direction, bit by bit.
Very good.
Yeah. I think for me, the use of language is a huge thing I'm passionate about, and I've seen it's probably had the biggest influence on how I've affected changes in attitudes towards health and safety. So, like I said, I don't like things being called a safety briefing or a safety training. So we just rephrase things. This is say you want to deliver something about scaffolds or ladders or CDM, which we do, and they're pretty tough subjects to people who are not health and safety advisors. Actually, sometimes they're pretty tough for safety advisors, but we call them technical top-ups or knowledge top-ups. Similarly, in construction, rather than stop works, you can have a pause works. So one of the things, basically, we look at designing everything from the user's point of view. So whether it's your runner on their first day in, straight out of school, straight into work, or it's your C-suite who is, gearing up for retirement. Always designing it from their point of view, and we have to curate it through and use different language. So one of the things that I do when I'm interviewing for new safety advisors is one of the tasks is to ask them to. So I have a HR person with me, and I say, okay, we're going to do a task. The HR person is going to a recruitment fair at a hotel, the classic kind of conference thing. She's going to set up a stand with a few bits and bobs. The hotel have asked her for her risk assessment. She's come to you and said, can you do me a risk assessment? Now, we don't do people's risk assessments, we facilitate it. So one of the things I ask in the interview is, can you explain a risk assessment to the HR? But you're not allowed to use the following words. And I've generally got 8 words. You're not allowed to use risk. You're not allowed to use likelihood, severity, matrix, control measures, form, things, all the buzzwords that we use. You're not allowed to use them. You need to talk about what is a risk assessment without showing them how to fill in a form. It's when you look at the regulation, like one of the best courses I've been on is the HSE Inspector's Guide to Risk Assessment. So one day, 500 quid, best spend of money ever. And you look through what a risk assessment requires you to do, and you just step back and go, why have I thrown a matrix on everything? Why am I talking in the jargon? So if I just, let me see if I can screen share this with you. This is one of my favorite ways. Let's have a look. Yeah, if I expand, there's a bit of nudge theory in the corner as well, if you want to take a look at that. But for me, this is what designing a safety message is. And you look at this if I'm in marketing and I'm selling handbags, or if I'm selling cars, or if I'm selling a wellness strategy, let's say. You need to design it from the user's point of view. Even when it comes down to a form, if you are looking at a form, there's a science to forms. The longer the question, the bigger the box, the more information the person filling it in is going to give you. So the really designing what you're doing for the user will have a much greater effect on the response that you get back, and how you engage them, and what they think and what they feel about safety.
I now feel very guilty for putting something quite similar to this over my child's cot for the last couple of years. I obviously wasn't taking his point of view into consideration enough when we put that up.
Yeah.
No,
but the other piece to look at is the difference as well then between the different generations. So the way I would talk about safety to a millennial and a Gen Z would be different, and how we curate the communication for those. So some people do want to do classroom training, start at 10 in the morning, finish at 4 p.m. But it's 2020, and the majority of my workforce doing this production safety passport are millennials, and millennials want agile working. So we're going to reposition it basically. So we have, say there's 10 modules, 2 of them will be a podcast, which you put the kids to bed, and then you'll do your 1 hour podcast tonight, you'll do your 1 hour podcast tomorrow. And then you'll do some videos, and then you'll do some interactive learning, and then some live. So going for hybrid learning and hybrid messaging. So in terms of using those tools for C-suite, it's things like putting a video together rather than, putting together size 12 black font on a white page. We're beyond that. If you look at Twitter and the 160 character rule, that was one of the things we applied to our messaging was, let's get it down to Twitter messaging. Let's get it as short and sharp as possible. And it's a real challenge for a safety advisor to kind of come away from what we had to do in order to pass our exams and talk in ways that the user will understand.
I think that's really interesting. It's the outcome you want, isn't it? You want the person to understand it. It's not about how you deliver it. It's getting the outcomes that you want from that message is the most important thing. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe a question to you both then, as we're kind of drawing towards the near the end. I think when I look at the poll here, so we've done the poll at the start of the talk, and it was looking about the kind of support levels that people get. So we've got 27% have always been supportive of new initiatives, but an overwhelming majority saying generally supportive, but push back on new initiatives or things like technologies or new approaches, and push back from board. So if we think about kind of how you look at that, I mean, obviously from our side, we think about it from a technology point of view and putting together business cases for software, because that's what we're involved in, but not necessarily just that. I mean, from a, if we're talking about technology or driving new initiatives, how do you best position that? If we're thinking about maybe 2 or 3 key takeaways for the listeners on, you're going in with a new initiative, you're going in with a technology, platform or something like that, a new technology that you want to try and pitch. What are the 2 or 3 things you might focus on? Who wants to grab that one first?
Go on. I think with that, it's answering that sort of what's in it for me question. It's and again, it sort of ties in with your pictures just there. It's if you're wanting people to do something new, from their point of view, oh, it's a burden, it's something else, it's extra, I'm already a bit overloaded. Well, actually, how will that help you do your job? Will you be able to do it better? Will you be able to advance your career? Will it free up time? Will it mean that actually by taking that on, you're seen as perhaps an extra level up in terms of your expertise? Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing I've found with working with large organizations where in the past we've sort of developed tools is actually involve them early on, involve them in the discussions and have sort of user groups and try and see what people, what problems they have, what's useful to them, what's not, what understands what their drivers are. And that I think what I've found with that is never start with a blank sheet of paper, always go up with this is what we're thinking of doing. But we want to know, or these are sorts of issues we want to address. But what we want to understand is what issues you're facing and what would be useful to you, what would not. And I get that discussion going and then make it iterative as your program or your tool is being developed. Mm-hmm. Actually show them at regular points, get feedback and adjust it. And then you've got a sort of ready enthusiasm and also a sort of sense of ownership by the time the official launch comes. Mm-hmm. And with that, it's sort of gone down better with other staff if they know that their peers have been involved, because there's a chance that they would have helped iron out some of the problems that everybody else has. So it has a bit more credibility. So I think it's that involving people and preparing rather than just here it is, you're going to be using this from next Monday.
Yeah, I think that engagement piece is always so important, isn't it? For any behavioural shift or behavioural change, having that engagement is critical. Zoe, any points there that you'd talk about?
Yeah, I think with technologies, I think you have to do your homework. I think you need to, if you're working with a company that's got the tech that you want to bring in and you've bought into it, or maybe you've used it in a different company and you want to bring this into your company, I think you have to buddy up with the salesperson from the company and go, teach me everything I need to know and do your homework. So getting the opportunity to go to a C-suite, you don't generally go to the whole lot, you'll go to 1 or 2 and to get buy-in. It's short and it's sharp and you've got to be ready. The last thing you want is to get there and for them to go, well, what's the FTP protocols? What's the SSO protocols? How does this fit in with our LMS? Blah, blah, and hit you back with stuff where you go, I wish I had the sales guy in the room with me. And chances are you're not going to be able to bring them in. But you need to be ready. And I think if you come across like you really know this piece, you know the ins and the outs, you know how it works, you know how it'll go with the LMS, you know about single sign, you know how it'll work with your company's current security measures, then you will come across far more credible. I would definitely, any idea you put through, you have got the kind of the influence, persuasion, the kind of the human piece, but you need to be a guru on it as well. So, and before you go in, stress test it. Find your most critical, the people that the naysayers, the ones that always hit everything down. They're your best buddies before you go into a C-suite, and propose to them and go, look, this is the idea, break it, like just tear me to shreds on this one. It's the same way if you're preparing for an interview, you get your friends, your really critical friends to kind of, tear you to shreds on it. But yeah, any technology I would be taking through, you get one chance to strike with the C-suite, so you have to go in and do your homework. H&S Advisor is one of the things that makes us great, that we can take nitty-gritty law and transfer it into language that people will understand. We make it applicable to the workplace. That's a beautiful kind of natural talent that we have. So do it with the technology as well. Don't be afraid of it. Embrace it. Get the sales team to show you and test it through and challenge them back, because chances are what you're going to get asked from your C-suite, the people who are selling the product will have already been asked and already have had to solve it at another company. So yeah, I would say do your homework.
Very good. No, very good. Look, where we get people engaging on that level, that's a dream for us, because we know we've got a partner there in terms of going through stuff. So it is. It's that's that bit of preparation goes a long way. A question there again, just around COVID, and I think it might be obviously a relevant question. Do you think that's changed anything in terms of the kind of board level awareness maybe of safety or approach to safety? Has anything shifted because of the pandemic right now in terms of how people are viewing safety practice, safety professionals?
I think the discussion has changed in the last 6 months. I think new words have entered people's everyday vocabulary that you would not have been talking about back in January. And I think the word that struck me most over in Britain was mitigation and mitigation measures. When it came out with the list of 39 steps, the extra mitigation measures that you could take in order to sort of go beyond a sort of 2 meters social distance, I think that took off as a language. And I've never heard anybody beyond sort of major hazards, people using mitigation measures as a phrase before that was sort of May, June time. But I think that's got it's engaged the whole population with risk issues and what's safe and what's not. And I think it'll probably also encourage people to ask more questions at work. And in that way, the board will be getting more engaged, because people are coming in and they've downloaded the copy of the guidance for their industry and what are we doing for that? And they'll be able to ask more questions, perhaps, of senior managers, board members now, and the board managers managers will have also perhaps needed to up their game a bit in order to have the conversations with their staff, because it's in every news program, every newspaper, Twitter every day, and I think it's quite good for just encouraging general risk awareness.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Zoe, from your side, have you seen any change, or do you perceive any changes to come around how people view it?
Yeah, I think it's the one thing that has affected every single member of the C-suite. Every single member can see. Nobody can go, yeah, no, it's finance's problem. It's every single person's problem. So they're engaged, and they're making it their business to know about it, which has been great. Interesting with the wording and everybody calling face coverings PPE. I've had to go, oh, hang on a sec now. That's we're not going into PPE regs with face coverings, little cotton masks. The interesting thing, and I've seen this chatting to different colleagues at different companies, is who is taking ownership of the COVID problem within the company. Now, companies that are facing redundancy and restructuring issues, some people who may not necessarily be part of a communicable disease issue are holding on to it. They're holding on to the coattails to justify their role, staying within the company and go, like, I'm, this comes under my remit. People will step up, pipe up, and push up, and it's very competitive, particularly in industries where there are job cuts, and you need to justify your position. So, in a way, for health and safety, our job has been made easier because there is so much good information coming out about solutions. So how you do homeworking, the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, CIEH, and Kirsty Angerer and that team, they have produced stuff that has made my job so much easier with helping people with homeworking. So I can take ownership of that. I think there's an opportunity for safety professionals to be seen as helping with the solution. Now, you don't have to make it up. It's out there. There's lots and lots of publications coming out from HSE, IOSH, and other great sources. And you can basically position yourself and go, well, here's the solution, here's the latest information, and be a leader on it. And it lifts your profile as being somebody that can help the business survive.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing now, because in order to keep your businesses open, you've got to be seen to be managing and mitigating the risk. And it's interesting how something that is actually a public health issue has been taken on as a health and safety issue. And government very early on were announcing HSE will be enforcing this, and there are stories that actually that's probably the first HSE heard about it when it's announced in Parliament. But what it has done is meant the health and safety practitioner is now critical. If you want to be able to keep your business open, you've got to be getting those mitigation measures in place so that you're COVID secure, to use the current phrase. And now it's actually it's a business critical role. You can't run a business, or can't keep a business open unless it is considered to be COVID secure. And that really has sort of boosted the health and safety professional in terms of their sort of significance.
Yeah, I think, look, it may make safety something that is more, open for discussion at C-level for those that already weren't, or, in the future that they're at least aware of, safety in a broader perspective. And like you said, it's on everyone's mind. They're all using the lingo, they're all using the language now. It's quite a shift. Guys, listen, I think we're kind of running up. We ran a little bit over. I think we were on for the air. We've just run a little bit over, but I want to say a huge thank you. It was a very interesting and engaging conversation with you both, and some great points of view. So I want to thank you very, very much for that. We'll do a little sort of just let anyone that's still listening to know there is recordings available. So if you did have to dip out to make the dinner or run out, look after kids, or do whatever else you have to do when you're home working, the recordings will be on the portal. So when you log back in, they'll be there. But Laura and the team will be kind of taking that and bringing it back out to people as well after the event. So there'll be some emails out with little blogs and video clips and some key takeaways from all the discussions as well. So that will all be there for people to digest. Anyone who has been listening, I think this is the last Mainstage show, so there is some stuff going on with customer workshops. If you're a customer and you want to dive into those, they're still going on for the afternoon and evening. But from the Mainstage bit, we would like to say thank you very much. Thank you to Mike. Thank you to Zoe. Very informative, very good conversation. Thank you for being part of it and for helping out with the charities as well, which, if you still haven't, last shout out for the charities, please do go and throw in a couple of pounds or euros to your preferred charity, please. It'll be hugely appreciated. Guys, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks.
Cheers.
All right.